The dark water of the French coast hides a massive secret. The German Empire uses the deep river to feed the heavy war machine. Fast merchant ships break the ocean blockade in the dead of night. They carry vital raw materials from the distant corners of the world. The port of Bordeaux is a safe and protected fortress for these dark vessels. The British commanders monitor the massive traffic with a profound sense of dread. They understand the supreme danger of the raw rubber and the heavy metals. The German factories need these specific materials to forge the tools of absolute destruction. A single merchant ship can sustain the massive enemy production for an entire month. The vital harbor must burn. The standard methods of massive attack are a complete and total failure. The heavy British bombers cannot hit the fast-moving ships in the dark river. The massive concrete bunkers protect the deep port from sudden aerial strikes. A direct naval assault is an absolute and profound suicide mission. The massive shore batteries would sink the British steel before it reached the river mouth. The desperate situation requires a massive and unconventional solution. The Supreme Command calls upon the bravest and most specialized men in the armed forces. The Royal Marines possess a dark and unique unit of silent warriors. These men specialize in absolute stealth and extreme cold water survival. They are the shadows that hunt in the freezing black ocean. The plan is a masterpiece of dark and insane military engineering. A massive submarine will carry the men to the edge of the French coast. The brave soldiers will leave the massive steel boat in the pitch-black night. They will paddle up the freezing river in fragile canvas canoes. The sheer massive audacity of the mission shocks the veteran British commanders. The target is miles inland, through a massive network of absolute pure danger. The riverbanks are packed with heavy German patrols and bright searchlights. The cold water is a massive and unforgiving beast that tames the strongest swimmers. The canvas boats offer zero protection against the heavy brass bullets of the enemy guards. The brave men must trust the dark shadows to survive. The weapons of the silent hunters are small, but possess massive destructive power. The men carry heavy magnetic mines designed to shatter the thick steel hulls. The devices require a close and absolute personal touch to achieve the fatal grip. The soldiers must attach the heavy explosives with their own freezing bare hands. The absolute raw courage needed for the task defies human comprehension. The volunteers step forward in the dark rooms of the British training camps. They are hardened men with cold eyes and immense physical strength. The intense preparation pushes their bodies and their minds to the absolute extreme limit. They practice the silent paddling techniques in the freezing rivers of the dark island. The bitter cold is a constant and unforgiving massive test of their willpower. The canvas boats are a marvel of simple and massive brilliant design. The wooden frames are wrapped in thick fabric to create a silent and fast vessel. The small boats glide through the dark water without making a single sound. The lack of heavy armor makes them invisible to the massive enemy radar stations. The supreme stealth is their single and absolute massive defense. The training requires the men to capsize their boats in the freezing ocean. They must right the fragile canoes and climb back inside while wearing heavy wet wool. The freezing temperature attacks their muscles and clouds their focused minds. The instructors show zero mercy during the brutal and massive physical evaluations. The dark river in France will offer even less compassion. The men form an unbreakable and profound bond in the freezing water. They learn to trust the silent partner sitting behind them in the dark canvas boat. The massive success of the mission depends on perfect and absolute synchronization. A single loud splash can alert the heavy German guards on the distant shore. The silent paddlers move as a single massive organism of pure stealth. The final selection process leaves profound physical scars on the brave men. The supreme commanders choose 10 soldiers for the dark and desperate operation. These men possess the required mix of immense strength and absolute cold calculation. They pack their massive explosives and their sharp combat knives into the small canvas bags. The time for practice is over, and the dark hunt is about to begin. The massive British submarine leaves the safe port and dives into the cold ocean. The 10 silent warriors sit in the dark and cramped steel core of the massive beast. The air smells of thick grease and nervous human sweat. The men sharpen their knives and check the massive magnetic fuses in absolute silence. The journey to the hostile French coast is a massive psychological test. The submarine captain navigates the massive minefields with cold and precise skill. The dark ocean above them hides the heavy German patrol boats. The massive steel hull creeps toward the designated drop zone in the black water. The profound tension in the dark metal tube reaches an absolute and extreme peak. The brave Marines paint their faces with thick black grease and prepare to launch. The massive submarine surfaces in the middle of a violent winter storm. The freezing waves crash over the wet steel deck in the pitch-black night. The brave Marines drag their fragile canvas boats out of the tight metal hatches. The violent ocean threatens to smash the small canoes against the massive submarine hull. The dark mission almost ends in absolute massive disaster before it even begins. The strong men fight the massive waves and secure the small canvas boats. They load the heavy explosives and climb into the fragile wet seats. The submarine captain watches the brave ghosts vanish into the dark and freezing mist. The massive steel boat dives back into the safe deep ocean and leaves the men behind. The 10 Marines are now alone in the massive and hostile dark void. The freezing wind bites through their thick wool coats and numbs their wet faces. The massive waves of the open ocean toss the small boats like broken pieces of driftwood. The physical exhaustion sets in during the first hour of the massive long paddle. The men fight the extreme urge to close their eyes and surrender to the cold. The dark river mouth is a massive and distant goal in the black storm. The tide turns against the brave paddlers and increases the massive physical resistance. The men push their wooden paddles into the freezing water with a deep and silent rhythm. The dark shapes of the French coast begin to emerge through the thick and heavy mist. The massive German searchlights sweep the dark water with bright and intense white beams. The absolute stealth phase of the massive operation is now active. The canvas boats slip past the massive concrete bunkers on the outer coast. The silent warriors hear the voices of the German guards carrying across the cold water. The supreme discipline of the brave men keeps them hidden in the deep, dark shadows. The cold river embraces the fragile boats and pulls them toward the massive inland port. The hunters are inside the massive fortress of the Dark Empire. The dark journey up the freezing river will require days of absolute silent endurance. The men must hide in the wet mud during the daylight and paddle in the pitch-black night. The massive enemy ships are waiting at the end of the long and brutal massive gauntlet. The true massive horror of the silent infiltration is just about to start. The massive tidal currents at the river mouth create a violent wall of freezing water. The brave men push their wooden paddles into the dark ocean with supreme force. The small canvas boats jump over the steep waves with a profound and terrifying motion. The physical demand on the human muscles is an extreme and absolute torture. The dark French coast remains a massive and distant shadow in the cold mist. The silence is the supreme law of the dark infiltration mission. The men cannot speak a single word to their partners in the small boats. The sound of a human voice carries across the flat water with massive clarity. The German guards on the distant shore listen to the dark night for any strange noise. The brave British Marines communicate through the simple rhythm of their wet wooden paddles. A massive rip current catches one of the fragile canvas canoes in the dark water. The violent ocean spins the small boat and throws the two men into the freezing void. The heavy wool uniforms absorb the cold water and drag the brave Marines down. The men fight the massive waves in absolute and profound, terrifying silence. They cannot scream for help, because the dark enemy is listening on the cold beach. The other small boats watch the massive tragedy unfold in the pitch-black night. The strict orders of the commander forbid any massive rescue operation. The survival of the vital mission is more important than the lives of two brave men. The floating Marines wave a silent and dark goodbye to their brothers in the cold water. The freezing ocean swallows the heroes and leaves zero trace of their massive sacrifice. The profound grief in the hearts of the surviving men is a massive, heavy weight. They must push the dark pain deep down and focus on the massive physical task. The freezing wind numbs their wet hands and freezes the water on their cold faces. The massive river mouth narrows, and the speed of the dark current increases. The remaining canvas boats enter the true massive danger zone of the hostile French territory. Another small boat strikes a massive submerged rock in the fast, dark current. The sharp stone tears a massive hole in the thin canvas bottom. The freezing water rushes into the fragile craft and sinks the massive boat in seconds. The two men swim to the hostile shore and vanish into the dark and freezing mud. The massive German patrols will hunt them through the dark woods at the break of dawn. The 10 men are now reduced to a profound and small fraction of their original massive strength. The brutal ocean and the dark rocks claim a massive toll before the true combat begins. The remaining Marines paddle with a renewed and dark absolute fury. The memory of their fallen brothers fuels their massive drive up the freezing Black River. The target is still a massive distance away in the cold and unforgiving night. The sky begins to turn a pale and cold grey on the eastern horizon. The dark cover of the night is lifting and exposing the massive, fragile boats. The commander signals the men to steer their canvas canoes toward the thick mud banks. The brave Marines drag the heavy boats out of the freezing water and into the tall reeds. The massive stealth phase transforms into a profound test of static and cold endurance. The men cover their fragile boats with camouflage nets and thick, wet mud. They lie flat on the freezing ground and wait for the massive sun to rise. The wet wool uniforms cling to their shivering bodies in the extreme cold morning air. They possess zero heat sources and cannot light a massive warm fire. A single wisp of smoke would bring the dark enemy forces rushing to their exact position. The massive German patrol boats cruise up and down the center of the dark river. The heavy diesel engines vibrate the mud beneath the bodies of the hidden British Marines. The men hold their breath as the massive steel hulls pass mere yards from their faces. The bright searchlights sweep the tall reeds and illuminate the cold morning mist. The sheer terror of discovery is a massive and profound physical ache in their chests. A group of German soldiers walk along the high riverbank above the hidden men. The massive heavy boots crunch the frost on the cold and hard dirt. The British Marines grip their sharp combat knives with frozen and stiff fingers. They prepare to fight a desperate and massive close-quarters battle in the dark mud. The enemy soldiers laugh and smoke their cigarettes before moving down the long, massive path. The massive relief of the passing patrol provides a profound but brief mental break. The men eat small pieces of hard chocolate and drink drops of precious fresh water. The massive caloric deficit of the brutal paddling drains their supreme human strength. Their muscles cramp and lock in the freezing mud of the dark riverbank. The human body is not designed to endure this massive level of prolonged absolute cold. The sun moves across the cold sky with an extreme and massive agonizing slowness. The daylight hours are a massive prison of absolute silence and profound freezing pain. The men cannot move a single muscle or stretch their aching cold limbs. The absolute discipline of the Royal Marines keeps them glued to the wet and freezing earth. The dark river flows past them with a massive and tempting gentle sound. The massive tide begins to shift and the cold water rises into the tall reeds. The freezing river soaks the men as they lie flat in their dark hiding spots. The massive physical suffering reaches an absolute new and profound extreme level. The brain urges the men to stand up and scream into the cold winter air. The supreme willpower of the silent warriors conquers the massive biological panic of the human mind. The sun touches the western horizon and paints the sky a massive dark red. The shadows lengthen across the freezing water and offer a profound, massive shield. The men wait for the absolute total darkness before they move a single frozen muscle. The massive joint stiffness causes profound physical agony as they push up from the mud. The dark predators prepare to return to their massive and freezing canvas boats. The brave Marines drag the heavy canvas canoes back into the cold and black current. The freezing water numbs their feet and sends massive shockwaves up their tired spines. They arrange the heavy magnetic explosives and grip the wet wooden paddles. The massive journey toward the dark enemy harbor resumes in the absolute pitch-black night. The sheer determination of the men is a massive and terrifying force of human nature. The dark river presents new massive obstacles and extreme profound dangers in the night. The water is choked with heavy debris and massive floating logs from the broken docks. The men must navigate the dark maze with absolute and zero margin for error. A massive collision with a heavy floating tree would destroy the fragile canvas boats. The silent paddlers use their raw instinct to sense the massive threats in the dark. The cold wind cuts through their wet clothes and steals their remaining massive body heat. The profound exhaustion plays dark tricks on their tired and massive frozen minds. The men see phantom patrol boats and hear massive fake voices in the howling wind. The extreme mental fatigue is a massive enemy that must be fought with absolute focus. The dark target requires a clear and sharp massive human intellect to achieve the destruction. The distant glow of the massive German port begins to illuminate the cold night clouds. The target is getting closer with every massive stroke of the wet wooden paddles. The immense danger grows as the river narrows and the enemy defenses become massive and thick. The small canvas boats are sailing straight into the absolute dark mouth of the massive beast. The brave Marines prepare their cold souls for the ultimate and massive final brutal test. The dark water around them is absolute and pure, freezing black death. The massive steel ships of the enemy empire wait in the bright distance. The silent ghosts of the river push forward with profound and massive dark intent. The raw courage of the small strike force will shake the foundation of the massive German war machine. The brutal night is long, but the massive revenge is absolute and coming fast. The canvas boats slip into the massive harbor. The water is thick with heavy oil and raw sewage. The dark shapes of the huge German merchant ships loom like massive iron mountains. The men stop paddling and let the slow current carry their fragile vessels. The freezing mist provides a thin and dark absolute shield. The bright searchlights sweep across the black water. The thick beams cut through the cold air with intense and blinding white power. The brave Marines freeze and lower their heads below the thin canvas rim. The harsh light passes over them and leaves a profound and dark afterimage in their tired eyes. The absolute terror of discovery is a massive and constant physical weight. The sheer size of the massive target ships is a profound shock to the silent men. The heavy steel hulls rise high above the small wooden boats. The dark metal walls block out the stars and cast a heavy absolute shadow on the freezing river. The immense scale of the enemy machine makes the men feel small and exposed. The Dark Empire possesses a massive and terrifying industrial power. The loud sounds of the active port fill the cold night air. Heavy cranes drop massive cargo nets onto the wooden docks. The German workers shout harsh commands in the dark shadows. The mechanical noise is a massive and dangerous cover for the silent approach of the British ghosts. The dark and chaotic environment is a massive test of their extreme combat training. The commander selects the first massive target for absolute destruction. It is a huge transport vessel loaded with raw rubber from the distant east. The dark ship is a vital and massive artery for the German war effort. The destruction of this specific hull will cause massive pain in the dark fascist empire. The cold and silent vengeance is about to strike the massive steel heart. The two men in the lead boat paddle toward the massive steel wall. They move their wooden oars with extreme and profound slow caution. A single drop of water falling from the wet blade could alert the guards on the deck above. The tension is a massive physical weight, crushing their cold and frozen chests. The dark river forgives zero mistakes in the massive freezing black water. The small canvas boat touches the cold iron of the massive ship. The men hold the fragile craft against the dark hull with their bare freezing hands. The steel is covered in thick green slime and sharp barnacles. The raw cold of the metal bites through their skin and chills their massive bones. The absolute brutal reality of the massive dark mission is here. The Marine in the front seat reaches into the dark canvas bag. He pulls out the heavy magnetic explosive device. The dark mine is a massive and brutal block of supreme concentrated destruction. The sheer weight of the weapon tests his tired and frozen arm muscles. He prepares to plant the massive seed of fire and absolute terror. The magnetic hold is massive and requires extreme physical strength to control. The Marine must place the heavy mine against the steel hull without making a loud and fatal noise. A sudden magnetic snap would echo across the dark harbor like a massive gunshot. The delicate task is an absolute nightmare in the freezing black water. The dark, cold night watches the massive and silent struggle. He presses his hands against the cold iron and guides the massive explosive. The strong magnets grab the thick steel with a sudden and intense invisible force. The Marine flexes his entire massive upper body to muffle the loud impact. The heavy mine attaches to the dark hull with a dull and massive underwater thud. The silent mechanical beast is awake and hungry. The dark device is armed with a slow and silent chemical fuse. The acid will burn through the thick wire over massive tense hours. The massive explosion will tear a huge hole in the lower steel hull long after the men are gone. The silent timer begins its massive and fatal countdown in the cold river. The British shadows leave their massive dark mark on the enemy metal. A German guard walks to the heavy steel rail above their fragile boat. The bright spark of a cigarette illuminates the hard face of the massive enemy soldier. The British Marines hold their breath and press their bodies against the cold iron wall. The dark shadow of the massive ship is their single and absolute supreme defense. The sheer proximity to the enemy is a profound and terrifying psychological torture. The enemy guard stares down into the freezing black water. The men in the canvas boat look up at the glowing tip of the dark cigarette. The massive and tense standoff feels like an absolute and profound eternity in the freezing cold. The dark night holds its breath as the massive threat lingers above the brave men. The guard flicks the hot ash into the river and turns away from the absolute edge. The intense relief washes over the men like a massive physical wave. They push the small boat away from the dark hull and slide back into the fast current. The first massive seed of absolute destruction is planted in the deep freezing water. The bold operation is a profound and massive success so far. The dark and silent warriors search for the next massive target. The second canvas boat targets a massive dark cargo ship moored near the center docks. The men repeat the terrifying and massive slow process in the freezing shadows. They attach their heavy magnetic explosives to the thick steel plates below the waterline. The dark river becomes a massive minefield of silent and profound chemical death. The Dark Empire is bleeding massive and fatal deep wounds. The brave Marines plant all their massive heavy weapons on the enemy hulls. Their dark canvas bags are empty, but their dark mission is far from over. The men are deep inside the massive and hostile heart of the German military machine. The profound, massive challenge of absolute survival and escape begins right now. The massive jaws of the dark trap are closing fast. The tide begins to turn, and the dark water flows back toward the freezing ocean. The men use the fast current to pull their fragile boats away from the massive docks. The bright searchlights continue to cut the night sky behind their cold backs. The massive target area shrinks into a dark and distant memory. The massive and brutal paddle toward absolute freedom begins in the dark. The massive chemical fuses burn in absolute silence beneath the dark merchant ships. The acid eats the thick wire with a slow and massive, focused intent. The German sailors sleep in their warm bunks with zero knowledge of the dark underwater doom. The massive floating mountains of steel are already dead machines. The massive technological revenge of the British Empire is perfect and absolute. The canvas boats must escape the massive river before the rising sun exposes them. The exhausted men paddle with their last massive reserves of supreme human energy. The pain in their shoulders is a constant and profound intense fire. The cold wind returns to bite their wet and freezing dark faces. The massive physical toll of the brutal night is absolute and supreme. The massive dawn will bring the sound of tearing steel and brutal explosive force. The dark river will boil with the sinking massive ruins of the German fleet. The silent ghosts of the canvas boats will vanish into the thick French countryside. The massive revenge of the British Empire is a profound and absolute freezing fact. The dark sky begins to turn a pale and cold grey in the east. The exhausted Marines push their wooden paddles into the fast-moving tide. They must escape the massive river before the full light of day reveals their fragile boats. The cold wind freezes the wet wool against their shivering skin. The raw, physical pain in their arms is a massive and constant fire. The men steer the canvas canoes toward the thick brush on the steep riverbank. They drag the heavy, wet boats out of the freezing water for the last time. The massive naval phase of the dark mission is complete. The men collapse in the freezing mud and gasp for the cold morning air. Their supreme human endurance is pushed to the absolute edge of breaking. A profound and massive rumble echoes across the cold, flat water from the distant port. The first chemical fuse finishes its slow and silent burn through the thick wire. The heavy magnetic mine detonates against the steel hull of the massive German transport ship. The profound shockwave shakes the cold mud beneath the bodies of the hidden British men. The massive dark seed of absolute destruction is awake. A massive pillar of black smoke and bright orange fire rises over the distant docks. The tearing sound of thick steel screams across the quiet morning air. The cold river rushes into the massive hole in the lower iron hull of the merchant vessel. The huge dark machine lists to one side and crushes the wooden piers. The German soldiers in the port wake up to a massive and sudden chaos. Another profound and massive explosion echoes through the cold French valley. A second target ship absorbs the brutal kinetic energy of the heavy British explosive. The massive steel plates buckle and shatter under the extreme underwater pressure. The dark harbor becomes a massive trap of sinking iron and burning crude oil. The absolute vengeance of the silent ghosts is a massive and terrifying reality. The distant explosions bring a grim and cold satisfaction to the exhausted men in the mud. They know their fallen brothers in the freezing ocean did not die in vain. The massive risk and the profound physical suffering produced absolute lethal results. The dark war machine of the enemy empire is bleeding massive amounts of vital resources. The silent warriors share a quiet look of profound and absolute pride. But the sound of the exploding ships also triggers a massive and immediate enemy response. The loud air raid sirens howl across the dark river and the distant French towns. The German commanders realize the massive destruction is an act of deliberate and calculated sabotage. The bright searchlights scan the sky, but the true massive threat came from the cold black water. The entire coastal defense grid enters a state of absolute and total panic. The massive hunt for the unseen attackers begins with extreme and brutal German efficiency. Fast patrol boats tear through the river water with heavy machine guns ready to fire. The soldiers on the shore deploy massive tracking dogs to search the cold mud banks. The brave Marines are now the absolute prime targets in a massive and hostile occupied zone. The brutal terrestrial escape is a new and profound nightmare. The men must erase all massive physical evidence of their dark river journey. They take sharp knives and slash the thick canvas skin of their fragile boats. The wooden frames break under the heavy stomping of their cold, wet boots. They tie heavy rocks to the broken pieces and sink the massive ruins in the deep river. The canvas ghosts vanish into the freezing black water forever. The transition from the dark water to the solid earth is a massive and painful shock. Their wet boots slip on the cold mud, and the sharp rocks cut their freezing hands. The men carry absolute zero rations and possess very limited dark ammunition. The long walk across the massive occupied French countryside requires a profound new level of survival skill. The men must move like absolute invisible shadows through the thick woods. The sun climbs higher and illuminates the massive hostile landscape. The men hide deep inside thick, thorny bushes to avoid the massive enemy patrols. The sound of heavy German trucks echoes on the distant dirt roads. The brave Marines lie in the cold dirt and hold their sharp combat knives in frozen hands. A single massive mistake will result in absolute and immediate execution. The cold, wet uniforms refuse to dry in the freezing and damp winter air. The men shiver with massive violence as the extreme cold attacks their core body temperature. They possess zero shelter and cannot risk moving in the bright and clear daylight. The massive physical toll of the previous nights begins to break their absolute supreme focus. The mind plays dark and terrifying tricks in the massive freezing silence. Thirst becomes a massive and sharp new enemy in the cold brush. The men cannot drink the dark river water full of massive salt and industrial oil. They lick the cold morning dew from the green leaves of the thick bushes. The small drops of fresh water offer absolute zero relief to their massive dry throats. The sheer desperate need for hydration is a constant and profound physical ache. The massive German dragnet tightens around the massive immediate river area. Small squads of enemy soldiers sweep the tall grass with heavy rifles and angry tracking dogs. The brave British men hear the dark barking echoing through the cold, quiet trees. They rub wet mud over their cold faces to hide their massive human scent from the beasts. The extreme tension of the absolute close proximity is a massive, crushing weight. A German patrol walks right past the thick bushes hiding the silent Marines. The massive leather boots crush the dry twigs mere inches from the faces of the British men. The Marines stop breathing and stare at the dark dirt with absolute cold focus. The enemy soldiers speak in harsh tones about the massive destruction at the main port. The massive danger passes and leaves the men drowning in profound cold sweat. The absolute discipline of the commandos prevents a massive and fatal premature attack. They know their small pistols and knives are useless against the heavy rifles of the patrol. The supreme objective is to evade the dark enemy and reach the distant, safe borders. The men must swallow their massive warrior pride and embrace the absolute cowardice of the shadows. The dark escape requires pure stealth and zero massive open confrontation. The shadows lengthen as the cold afternoon turns into a massive dark evening. The men prepare to move their frozen bodies across the dangerous open fields. The night is their absolute supreme shield in the massive and hostile foreign land. They memorize the massive map coordinates and set a course for the distant southern mountains. The long walk to absolute freedom is a massive and brutal test of sheer will. The dark sky offers a cold and massive protective blanket over the French countryside, the men step out of the thick brush and begin the massive long march south. Their legs are stiff and their cold feet bleed inside the wet leather boots. Every single massive step is a profound and deliberate act of extreme physical defiance. The silent ghosts of the dark river become the dark shadows of the cold earth. The massive glow of the burning port paints the northern sky a deep blood red. The massive fires will burn for days and consume massive amounts of German steel. The brave men leave a massive and profound scar on the face of the Dark Empire. They proved that a few silent warriors can strike a massive and fatal blow in the dark. The legend of their absolute raw courage is secure in the massive flames. The dark journey ahead is filled with massive enemy checkpoints and freezing winter rain. The men must trust the brave French civilians to hide them from the massive dark patrols. The absolute survival of the commandos is a massive and terrifying gamble in the dark. The brutal and cold evasion through the occupied territory will push them to the absolute massive brink. The night march across the massive French fields is a profound test of human endurance. The cold earth freezes beneath their wet boots and numbs their tired feet. The men walk in absolute silence under the massive dark cover of the winter sky. They avoid the main dirt roads and stick to the thick tree lines. The dark shadows hide their movement from the massive enemy patrols. The distance to the safe borders is a massive and terrifying dark geographic reality. The brave Marines must cross an entire massive hostile nation on their cold, bleeding feet. The physical damage from the freezing river paddle multiplies with every massive step on the hard ground. Their muscles lock and their dark, heavy joints ache with profound and absolute freezing fire. The massive, brutal journey requires an absolute superhuman level of dark mental grit. The distant bark of the massive German tracking dogs echoes across the cold valleys. The dark enemy is hunting the saboteurs with a massive and brutal, relentless focus. The men cross fast freezing streams to wash their massive human scent from the water. The cold liquid bites their tired legs and forces a massive shiver through their spines. The dark pursuit is a massive and terrifying constant pressure in the night. The massive physical toll begins to separate the brave men in the dark brush. Two Marines fall behind the main group with massive and profound exhaustion. Their cold legs refuse to carry their massive weight another single inch. The Dark Commander makes a brutal and necessary massive decision in the cold shadows. The men must split up to increase their massive chances of absolute survival. The separation is a massive and dark strategic move in the freezing woods. Smaller targets are harder for the massive enemy search teams to locate in the vast earth. But the massive loss of absolute physical backup leaves the men feeling exposed in the dark. The brave Marines shake hands and share a profound dark look of absolute silent respect. The men turn their backs and walk into the massive, dark, freezing void. The small, broken teams are now scattered across the massive and hostile dark map. The separation is a massive psychological blow to the brave and silent warriors. They fought together in the massive freezing river and now face the dark earth alone. The cold night swallows their brothers and leaves a massive empty void in their tired hearts. The absolute isolation is a new and profound massive terror. A massive winter rain begins to fall and turns the dark fields into thick mud. The cold water soaks their wool uniforms and steals their remaining massive body heat. The men shake with massive violent tremors in the pitch-black freezing night. They seek massive shelter inside an old abandoned stone barn near a dark, dense forest. The broken wooden roof offers a small measure of profound, absolute protection. The sunrise forces the men to hide deep inside the massive piles of old hay. They listen to the heavy boots of the German soldiers walking on the dirt road outside. The dark enemy speaks in harsh, massive tones about the hunt for the British ghosts. The men grip their sharp combat knives and prepare for absolute close-quarters violence. The massive patrol moves past the barn and spares the hidden, exhausted men. Hunger becomes a massive and sharp beast inside their cold stomachs. The men possess zero provisions and cannot hunt for fresh meat in the dark woods. A single gunshot would bring the entire massive German army to their exact location. They chew on raw, bitter roots pulled from the freezing dirt to trick their minds. The massive caloric deficit drains their supreme physical strength with every single step. The men must risk massive absolute exposure to find basic human sustenance. They wait for the dark night and approach an isolated, massive French farmhouse. The brave Marines knock on the thick wooden door with profound and desperate hesitation. The local farmer opens the door and sees the massive, desperate state of the armed men. The brave civilian decides to risk his own massive life to hide the foreign soldiers. The brave French citizens provide hot soup and thick, dry blankets to the shivering men. The warm food is a massive and profound miracle in the dark and brutal winter. The language barrier is broken by the massive shared hatred for the dark occupying empire. The farmer hides the men in his massive dark cellar below the stone kitchen floor. The brief taste of absolute human kindness is a massive shield against the cold terror. The rest in the dark cellar is short and filled with massive, profound nightmares. The men hear the distant, massive explosions of the coastal bombs in their tired minds. They know the German anger is a massive and blind beast tearing the local countryside apart. The safe French farm is a massive risk to the brave, innocent local people. The men must leave the warm shelter and resume the dark, massive march south. The dark road to the distant southern mountains is full of massive enemy checkpoints. The German soldiers inspect massive, heavy wagons and question the local French workers. The British Marines watch the massive, strict security from the cold and distant high ridges. The dark evasion requires profound, absolute patience and a massive amount of cold calculation. A massive single mistake means a blindfold and a massive execution. The constant paranoia is a massive psychological poison in the cold and dark woods. Every snapped twig sounds like a massive rifle bolt racking in the dark shadows. The men cannot trust their own tired eyes in the freezing and thick night mist. The profound lack of sleep degrades their sharp, massive military focus. The absolute sheer will to survive is the single massive force pushing them forward. The winter frost covers the green fields in a massive sheet of hard white ice. The men walk across the frozen ground and leave massive, deep footprints in the white frost. The dark tracking dogs will smell the fresh tracks and follow the desperate human scent. The men must walk in freezing streams again to break the massive dark trail. The cold water is a massive torture, but it is their absolute supreme salvation. The moon provides a bright and massive silver glow over the dark French fields. The beautiful light is a massive curse for the men trying to hide in the open. The pale illumination exposes their dark, moving silhouettes to any distant enemy guard. The brave Marines must crawl on their bellies through the freezing mud for massive miles. The sharp rocks cut their knees, and the cold dirt fills their bleeding wounds. The massive lack of basic medical supplies makes every small cut a massive dark threat. The dirty wounds begin to fester and burn with massive absolute red infection. The men ignore the massive physical pain and focus on the dark, distant horizon. The mind conquers the broken body through absolute, profound, massive determination. The human spirit is stronger than the dark steel and the freezing cold mud. A massive German transport train passes near their dark, hidden position in the brush. The heavy steam engine pulls massive flat cars loaded with thick, dark armor and heavy cannons. The massive iron machine shakes the cold earth and drowns out the howling winter wind. The brave Marines watch the massive enemy strength moving toward the distant dark front lines. The entire occupied continent is a massive armed fortress of pure, absolute terror. The sun begins to rise again and forces the men to seek a new, massive, dark hole. The endless cycle of dark movement and massive static terror continues without mercy. The brave men are shrinking into absolute thin shadows of their former massive selves. The distant southern mountains remain a massive, impossible dream in the cold morning light. The massive hunt will push them toward an absolute dark and fatal ultimate climax. The cold French earth is a massive and unforgiving dark prison for the hunted men. They must cross hundreds of massive hostile miles to reach the neutral Spanish border. The massive ocean and the dark river are behind them, but the true massive horror remains. The brutal terrestrial escape will extract a massive and fatal toll in human blood. The massive dragnet closes around the broken fragments of the British strike force. The German patrols use brutal, massive force to interrogate the local farmers. The dark enemy demands absolute total compliance from the terrified French civilian population. The thick boots of the soldiers kick open heavy wooden doors in the dead of night. The brave Marines hear the distant screams of the innocent people they tried to protect. A small team of 2 isolated Marines walks into a massive and fatal dark trap. The men step out of the thick brush and spot a quiet dirt crossroad. The dark shadows hide a massive German ambush unit waiting in the cold trees. The sudden massive flash of heavy machine guns shatters the quiet winter silence. The brave British ghosts fall into the freezing mud under a massive storm of hot brass. The German soldiers approach the massive bleeding bodies in the cold, dark dirt. They search the wet wool uniforms and find absolute proof of the sabotage mission. The dark commanders broadcast the massive, brutal success across the entire local radio network. The surviving Marines hear the dark news from a brave local resistance fighter. The massive psychological blow threatens to break their profound, absolute, dark resolve. The massive grief mixes with the constant, deep physical pain in their cold joints. The men must swallow the massive sorrow and continue the dark march south. The supreme sacrifice of their fallen brothers demands an absolute and complete successful escape. The dark French fields become a massive and permanent graveyard for the silent warriors. The cold earth absorbs their brave blood without a single sound of massive pity. The winter weather takes a massive and violent turn for the absolute worst. A thick blizzard drops a massive sheet of blinding white snow over the dark woods. The deep freeze covers the massive dirt roads and the fast dark rivers. The freezing wind cuts through their wet clothes and attacks their massive core temperature. The men walk blind through the massive white storm like dead empty shells. The deep snow slows their massive forward progress to a desperate and profound crawl. The men must lift their cold, heavy boots high above the massive, thick drifts. The absolute physical exertion burns their last massive reserves of supreme human energy. Their dark vision blurs, and the massive white landscape plays terrible dark tricks on their minds. The sweet, massive temptation to lie down in the soft snow is absolute supreme torture. The local French resistance networks begin to organize a massive and secret dark rescue. The brave men and women risk absolute total execution to save the hunted British soldiers. They leave small, massive signs carved into the dark bark of the thick forest trees. The hidden marks point the exhausted Marines toward massive safe houses and warm barns. The dark underground army becomes a massive and vital shield against the German hunters. A massive local baker smuggles the British men inside the back of his wooden cart. The tired Marines hide beneath massive, empty bags of white flour and dark wheat. The cart approaches a massive German checkpoint guarded by heavy steel and sharp bayonets. The brave baker smiles and offers fresh, warm bread to the cold enemy soldiers. The massive dark tension under the flour bags is a profound and absolute crushing weight. The enemy guards chew the warm bread and wave the massive wooden cart forward. The brave Marines breathe a massive sigh of profound, absolute relief in the dark dust. The local French heroes risk their own massive innocent kin to defy the Dark Empire. The men owe their massive continued survival to the pure, absolute courage of the common people. The massive underground war is fought with silent, dark acts of pure defiance. The dark journey resumes on foot after the massive cart ride ends in the woods. The men possess a renewed massive spark of profound, absolute dark hope. The massive southern border is getting closer with every brutal step in the freezing snow. The massive Pyrenees mountains loom on the distant dark horizon like a wall of rock. The extreme and massive final physical obstacle stands between the men and absolute freedom. The German hunters focus their massive absolute attention on the border crossings. The enemy commanders know the massive final objective of the escaping British ghosts. They deploy heavy, massive patrols and bright searchlights along the entire dark mountain range. The massive steel trap is set and waiting for the desperate, freezing men to arrive. The dark escape route is a massive and narrow funnel of absolute certain death. The men must climb the massive freezing peaks to avoid the guarded valley roads. The steep, massive incline forces the Marines to crawl on their frozen hands and knees. The thin mountain air starves their exhausted lungs of vital, massive oxygen. The sharp rocks cut through their wet wool uniforms and tear their cold skin. The massive climb is an absolute brutal test of supreme human will. The snow on the high massive peaks is deep and conceals absolute profound danger. A massive wrong step means a fatal drop into a dark and freezing abyss. The men tie themselves together with a massive short length of old heavy rope. They share the massive ultimate risk of sudden death in the cold dark clouds. The absolute brotherhood forged in the massive river remains strong on the freezing peaks. A massive blizzard strikes the high pass and blinds the exhausted climbing men. The extreme and absolute cold freezes their wet eyebrows and numbs their bleeding lips. They carve a massive small cave in the deep snow to survive the violent storm. The men huddle together and share their absolute remaining massive body heat in the dark. The sheer raw determination to live is a massive burning fire in their cold chests. The dawn breaks clear and reveals a massive, profound view of the distant valleys. The men look down at the massive green fields of the neutral Spanish nation. The dark and occupied massive French territory is far behind their cold, bleeding backs. The absolute supreme objective is within their massive and painful final grasp. The brave men prepare to descend the massive slope and cross the dark, unseen line. A distant German mountain patrol spots the dark, moving shapes in the white snow. The enemy soldiers raise their heavy rifles and fire across the massive, deep gorge. The massive brass bullets crack through the thin, cold air and strike the hard ice. The men dive for massive, absolute cover behind a thick wall of frozen grey stone. The massive, dark hunt reaches its final, absolute, violent climax on the freezing peak. The British Marines possess 0 massive heavy weapons to return the enemy fire. They must use the steep, massive terrain to escape the long-range, heavy shots. The men slide down the massive snowbanks with absolute terrifying and blind speed. The massive white avalanches chase them down the extreme dark face of the high mountain. The chaotic, massive descent is a desperate blur of cold ice and sharp rock. The heavy German fire stops as the men cross the massive unseen borderline. The enemy soldiers cannot enter the massive neutral territory to pursue the fleeing targets. The brave British ghosts hit the massive soft dirt of the safe and warm Spanish valley. The massive and impossible dark mission ends in the quiet shade of a green tree. The absolute supreme escape is a massive and profound human miracle. Out of the massive original strike force of 10 brave and silent warriors, a mere 2 exhausted and bleeding massive men survived the freezing river and the dark hunt. The profound, massive sacrifice of the 8 fallen brothers weighs heavy on their tired souls. The massive dark victory in the enemy port required an extreme and absolute blood price. The massive dark water and the cold mud claim their massive eternal reward. The surviving men will carry the massive dark memory of the freezing canvas boats forever. The quiet, massive heroes will return to the island nation to fight another dark day. The massive broken steel in the distant French port is a permanent and absolute monument. The rising sun reveals the ruined port. The thick smoke hides the clear sky. The burning crude oil turns the dark river into a vast black inferno. The Dark Empire wakes up to a heavy and profound disaster. The German commanders arrive at the broken stone docks. They stare at the giant steel ships resting on the cold river bottom. The sheer scale of the total destruction is a profound shock to their arrogant minds. The initial dark reports suggest a huge aerial attack, but the heavy anti-aircraft cannons fired 0 brass shells in the night. The radar stations registered 0 heavy bombers in the cold winter sky. The sudden attack is a profound and absolute dark mystery. German divers enter the cold black water to investigate the broken steel. They find the shattered remains of the heavy magnetic explosives attached to the iron hulls. The dark truth strikes the proud enemy generals like a heavy physical blow. A small strike force penetrated the supreme absolute fortress of the Dark Empire. The invincible naval shield is a broken and fragile dark illusion. The severe psychological impact hits the top ranks of the dark regime. The local port officers face strict and brutal dark retribution from the Supreme Command. The absolute failure to detect the silent ghosts is an unforgivable, severe sin. The dark tyrant demands absolute brutal answers for the huge strategic loss. The search teams find the broken canvas boats in the cold river mud. The fragile wooden frames are a deep and profound insult to the German steel. The dark commanders realize they were beaten by men paddling small, fragile toys. The loss of the raw rubber and the heavy metals slows the vast war machine. The weapon factories in the dark homeland halt their loud, continuous production. The destroyed merchant ships leave a giant void in the absolute transport network. The dark rage of the enemy commanders translates into a brutal and cold crackdown. The occupation of the vast French coast becomes an absolute reign of terror. The Dark Empire lashes out at the brave local civilian population. In the distant British island, the High Command waits in a deep, dark silence. The radio channels remain absolute static for many cold weeks. The lack of direct communication is a heavy and crushing psychological weight. The grand news of the port explosions reaches London through the brave French underground. The coded dark messages confirm the sinking of the giant target ships. The dark and impossible mission is an absolute and profound, huge success. The supreme British commanders understand the severe human cost of the dark victory. The absolute silence of the 8 missing Marines is a heavy, dark fact. The cold river and the dark woods claimed their deep, eternal toll. The survival of the 2 brave men is a rare miracle of supreme human endurance. The secret intelligence networks confirm their safe arrival in the neutral southern land. The dark escape across the vast, hostile continent is a profound, absolute triumph. The British Prime Minister reads the dark, classified report with profound, deep respect. The small canvas boats achieved a huge strategic victory against all absolute odds. The raw, physical courage of the 10 men inspires the entire dark nation. The silent warriors become a grand hidden legend within the British armed forces. Their absolute strict dedication defines the true dark spirit of the Royal Marines. The high standard of absolute courage is set for all future generations. The giant enemy harbors are no longer considered absolute safe havens. The German captains must post heavy armed guards in the freezing cold night. The dark fear of the unseen canvas ghosts haunts the large merchant fleets. The psychological deep victory equals the physical absolute destruction of the heavy ships. The Dark Empire must waste vital resources to defend their quiet inner rivers. The silent men force the arrogant enemy to look deep into the dark shadows. The British war machine uses the precious time bought by the brave, silent men. The loud factories build more heavy Spitfires and fast armored tanks. The huge flow of new weapons prepares the island for the absolute final invasion. The families of the 8 fallen men receive the dark and solemn news. They mourn their brave sons and brothers in absolute and quiet, strict dignity. The supreme sacrifice is a strong foundation stone for the absolute freedom of the world. The dark water of the French River holds the deep secret in eternal silence. The broken steel ships bleed thick dark oil into the freezing tide. The cold revenge of the canvas ghosts is a permanent and absolute historical truth. The Grand War demands massive courage to defeat the Dark Empire. The men of the canvas boats delivered absolute and supreme fear into the iron heart of the enemy. The Dark River operation remains a profound symbol of raw human willpower. The brave, silent ghosts changed the massive tide of the ocean conflict. The massive steel ships could not defeat the simple wooden paddles. The deep French water keeps the dark secrets of that freezing winter night. The broken canvas boats rest deep in the cold mud below the heavy tides. The river flows in absolute peace today, but the massive dark history remains. The current washes over the rocks where the men shivered in the thick mist. The dark shadows of the tall reeds remember the silent, brave warriors. The surviving 2 Marines brought the massive dark tale back to the free world. Their absolute physical endurance is a massive lesson in supreme survival. They lived to see the dark fascist empire fall to massive total ruin. The massive bright flags of freedom replaced the dark banners of absolute terror. The quiet heroes never asked for supreme massive glory or loud public parades. The British armed forces study the massive daring raid with profound deep reverence. The strict silent training of the modern special forces is built upon this dark foundation. The men learn to embrace the freezing cold water and the deep black night. The absolute supreme standard of the brave 10 men is a massive permanent target. The dark canvas canoes are the grand ancestors of the modern silent submersibles. The brave French citizens who risked total execution also deserve profound absolute honor. The local resistance fighters provided the massive vital shield in the dark occupied woods. The shared hatred for the dark tyrant forged a massive, unbreakable steel bond. The common people fought the Dark Empire with silent and massive brave acts. The absolute final victory belongs to all the brave souls in the shadows. The dark grave of the fallen Marines is the cold earth of the foreign land. They sleep in profound absolute peace beneath the massive green grass. The dark, violent war ended, and the silent men can rest their tired, cold bones. The island nation owes a massive and permanent debt to their absolute extreme sacrifice. The blood of the brave ghosts watered the massive seeds of modern freedom. The massive German war machine could never understand the true power of free men. The enemy generals relied on massive concrete bunkers and thick steel armor plates. They ignored the massive absolute strength of the human mind and the human spirit. The dark, arrogant empire fell because it underestimated the profound courage of free nations. The men in the canvas boats proved that pure will shatters heavy iron. The dark river in Bordeaux is a massive and quiet commercial path again. The massive cargo ships sail the deep water without the dark fear of sudden explosions. The people walk the stone docks in absolute and profound total peace. The massive chemical fires and the screaming steel are a distant dark memory. The bright sun reflects off the cold water and erases the dark shadows, but the dark, massive legend of the silent operation will never fade away. The books of massive history record the brave deeds of the 10 freezing men. The deep cold winter of the massive raid is an absolute immortal chapter. The raw, absolute violence of the Dark War is preserved in the silent written words. The future generations must read and understand the massive human cost of peace. The dark and violent world requires brave men to step into the cold, freezing shadows. The massive, absolute defense of freedom is a constant and demanding heavy task. The dark tyrants will always build massive steel machines and heavy concrete walls. The silent warriors will always find a massive and clever way to break them. The supreme massive courage is a constant and eternal human weapon. The physical massive pain of the long dark march is gone. The cold massive terror of the dark water is a closed massive book. The men achieved absolute massive perfection in the art of the silent, violent strike. The dark empire bled thick black oil and massive tears of absolute total frustration. The brave British ghosts won the massive psychological battle of the dark night. The massive heavy brass medals sit in quiet, dark wooden boxes. The ribbons of supreme absolute honor gather dust in the silent empty rooms. The true massive reward is the absolute continued existence of the free world. The men fought and died for the massive simple right to live in peace. The dark and massive sacrifice was an absolute and profound pure necessity. The small canvas boats achieved a massive and impossible military objective. The 10 men beat the massive steel ships and the heavy-armed German patrols. The deep river and the massive winter snow failed to stop their dark mission. The absolute supreme odds were a massive mountain of profound, certain death. The brave ghosts climbed the massive mountain and stood on the absolute peak. The extreme cold of the massive water is hard to imagine in the warm, bright day. The absolute sheer terror of the dark, hidden mudbanks is a massive, distant thought. The profound, massive exhaustion of the men is beyond absolute standard human comprehension. The silent warriors transcended the massive normal limits of the fragile human body. The men became absolute massive machines of pure dark intent and supreme willpower. The dark and massive story ends on the high peaks of the cold border mountains. The massive journey from the dark freezing ocean to the high white snow is complete. The men cross the massive absolute threshold of profound human endurance. The deep valleys and the massive cold rivers are far behind their tired backs. The massive silent operation is an absolute and perfect military masterpiece. The massive memory of the dark hunt will live in the cold shadows forever. The brave men are eternal massive phantoms of the deep and freezing black water. The dark river will always whisper their names in the cold and quiet night wind. The massive brave ghosts of the canvas boats hold a massive absolute place in time. The strict and absolute honor of the Marines is a massive shining beacon. The heavy iron of the massive broken ships is gone from the cold river floor. The dark rust dissolved into the massive and powerful deep ocean tides. The massive evidence of the absolute violent strike is erased from the physical earth. But the massive profound impact of the dark mission remains a massive permanent truth. The massive absolute blow to the dark empire is carved in solid hard stone. The massive silence of the dark operation speaks louder than massive heavy cannons. The stealth and the raw courage beat the massive loud noise of the dark enemy. The massive bright explosions in the cold port were the grand massive exclamation point. The dark silent ghosts wrote a massive and profound epic in the freezing cold water. The massive total victory in the shadows is an absolute and pure masterpiece. The final massive curtain falls on the cold and dark French river. The brave men pass into the massive and absolute eternal halls of supreme glory. The dark canvas boats and the heavy magnetic explosives are silent massive relics. The massive grand war is over, and the free world breathes the warm, clean air. The dark, freezing night is conquered by the bright, absolute light of total freedom. Picture yourself sitting in a fragile canvas boat in the pitch-black, freezing night, with the massive steel hull of an enemy ship inches from your face. Drop a comment below and tell me how you would control your massive terror in the cold, dark water. Hit the subscribe button to join our pursuit of absolute intense combat history. I will see you in the next dark chapter of human warfare.